mass extinction that we are currently witnessing. Globally, there is increasing concern and consensus about how the loss of biodiversity and what its potential cascading effects on climate, food production, and human lives are. In this context, the United Nations selected this year's theme for the Biodiversity Day to be from agreement to action, and how we can build back biodiversity. The underpinning of the theme is the Vision 2030 coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which has been ratified to set targets which all the countries, all the ratifying countries has to meet by 2030. And today in our panel discussion, we are trying to explore one fundamental underpinning of this biodiversity framework, that of biocultural diversity and the rights of indigenous people and communities. The concept of biocultural diversity will be explained in more detail by Samira, one of our panelists today, but we have incorporated it as our topic today because of two vital aspects. The first being that biodiversity in general has co-adapted and even co-evolved with culture across millennia. And when we are talking about conserving only biodiversity, it is many times not possible if you're not also conserving the cultures, the local knowledge, the traditional ecological knowledge that's associated with the biodiversity. And we have plenty of examples and case studies to show from across the world that a focus on biocultural diversity has yielded much better long-term benefits to sustainable conservation than focus on protection and biodiversity alone. The second reason being that traditional West conservation models has largely excluded the traditional ecological knowledge, local beliefs, local rights from conservation. And hence the coming Montreal framework also attempts to right these historical injustices. That's why we thought this might be a very useful forum to talk about biocultural diversity and also what we as a consortium in India are trying to do to meet these targets. So I would like to now introduce today's panel. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Samira Agnihotri. She is currently associated with the archives at NCPS, and she has more than 15 years of experience in working on the conservation of biocultural diversity. Most of her work has been with the Sholiga community in BR Hills, Bilgiri Hills, and she has looked at bird songs and the traditional ecological knowledge associated with bird songs and how we can decolonize research through her work. Joining us today is also Dr. Tash, who is the founder of the Coexistence Consortium, and he has been supporting the consortium through his flagship Lantana Elephants program, which is a very exciting initiative where the Real Elephant Collective, it's an organization, and they build life-sized elephants made out of lantana. And this lantana is extracted from the forests as a weed and it's detrimental towards forest ecosystems. And these life-size elephants then travel around the world, spreading awareness on coexistence, also raising resources for conservation of our biodiversity and also biocultural diversity. We also have Dhi with us today. And Dhi has a background in psychology, and she has been studying local culture and folklore that enable shared spaces between people and large cats, mostly working in Himachal Pradesh and Maharashtra. And she's also currently the manager of the Coexistence Fellowship Programme, which is hosted at the University of Trans-Disciplinary Health Sciences and Technology in Bangalore. It's one of the pathways of the Coexistence Consortium. And we will also share more details about how the consortium and how the fellowship program has sort of incorporated the ethos of biocultural conservation. But before that, I would request Samira to maybe just introduce us to the concept of biocultural diversity and share some of your experiences, and then we go ahead from there. Samira, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ro, and welcome to all our participants today. Am I loud enough? There was a comment in the chat box about our volumes. Okay, great. So just to give an introduction, a detailed introduction to what is biocultural diversity. As Louisa Murphy, who is the co-founder and director of TerraLingua, defined it, biocultural diversity is the diversity of all life in all its manifestations, biological, cultural, and linguistic, which are interrelated and have co-evolved, as Orithro said, within a complex socio-ecological adaptive system. And many of the areas of the world are inhabited by small isolated communities and are also home to large numbers of endemic plant and animal species. So if you overlay a map of vertebrate diversity or plant diversity of the world and you overlay it with the linguistic diversity, there is a huge overlap between these areas. And therefore, these people or these communities are also considered to be stewards of their environments. And the loss of language diversity means a disappearance of the traditional ecological knowledge that has co-evolved with these ecosystems and is an important factor in the conservation of biodiversity. To give an example, I would like to quote from a paper by my friend and collaborator, Dr. Ong Si, who's a linguist. And this paper is one of my most favorites, and it's titled Biology in Language Documentation. So he and I both have worked in the BR Hills together, in the Biligiri Rangan Hills, in South Karnataka, where the Soliga people live. And to quote from his paper, he says, the Soliga forest type, Kanu Kadu, is often glossed by field biologists visiting the region as evergreen forest, which they define as a forest dominated by trees that do not shed their leaves, right? As opposed to deciduous forest. Now ask a Soliga person to describe a Kanu Kadu, and they will likely mention the following features. It's always cold and dark. It occurs on the flat tops of hills. It's a continuous stretch of forest with year-round water in the streams, contains very large trees, and they might name some of the species that they know are found in these Kanu Kadu, and what animals live there, especially in the rainy season, and how the animal communities change with the changing season. So to give an example like this is to highlight the fact that indigenous communities view the forest around them as a network of ecological relationships, with humans being a part of this network, right? So just like the biodiversity is endangered, so are these knowledge systems. And it's equally important for biologists to consider them, these knowledge systems. It's well known now, research has shown that the most resilient socio-ecological systems are those where these connections between cultures and the biodiversity they are founded on are alive and strong. And to add a bit about coexistence, these cultures that have co-evolved have also found a way to coexist with the creatures, large and small, that they share spaces with. So it is these ways that our Coexistence Fellowship aims to document and share with the world, so that we can enable communities to continue to be the stewards of their landscapes, and so that we can learn from them to find ways to live well with nature around us. And Orithro and Dhi will talk more about that later. So just to put it all together, recent research has shown that such approaches of including a biocultural diversity can be in alignment with core conservation goals. And a very good example is from Hawaii, which is held up as a global model for biocultural restoration in academia. And therefore, it is imperative that we adopt a rights-based approach to move towards the conservation of not just biodiversity, but biocultural diversity. Thanks.
Thanks, Samira. And we'll also come back to you again for more insights and depth comments on biocultural diversity. But it's very interesting that you shared the concept of rights-based approach to conservation. And I was also talking about what the Western conservation model largely has been excluding indigenous rights and also people from their territories. And Tash has been working on rights-based conservation for many years in Gudlur, Nilgiri area. So Tash, would you like to throw some light on the importance of rights-based conservation and why in the long term, conservation can only be spearheaded by local communities in the region, drawing from your experiences, please?
Yeah, thanks, Orithro. So Before I kind of jump into the whole question of rights-based conservation, I'd kind of maybe situate it with a little story. Maybe about 15 years ago when I started, my undergraduate degree was in physics, and I used to teach physics, maths, and science basically. And I was interested in documenting knowledge of forests. I was sitting with a group of honey hunters from the Karnataka community, trying to see if we could document their knowledge of bees and honey into a formal school curriculum, so that teaches children who are maybe not going to go back into the forests and interact with their elders and get honey in the same way, could at least learn about this through a classroom setting. That was my objective. So we sat and we talked about all this, and I asked them, can you tell me the kinds of honeys, kind of bees, and which flowers they go from and all that. And they kind of rattled off various things. The three things that I mapped nicely onto scientific knowledge was the bee species, right? There's Apis dorsata, the big rock bee, Apis cerana, the small bee, and Apis florea, the very small stingless bee almost. And I thought, great, it's nicely mapping on, we are kind of bringing all this knowledge together. But a couple of days later, when we were going for a walk in the forest, they pointed out some other bee to me. And I said, hey, we sat for half a day and we chatted at great length about all the bees, and you told me only 3 bees. Now why are you telling me 4 bees? And then the old man tells me, but the bees live in the forest, right? Not in the classroom. So the point to note is that knowledge of all this, the biocultural knowledge of ecosystems, of forests, is not something that can kind of live in a kind of isolation of the people and the environment in where that knowledge exists. And this is not a simple, trivial topic, right? Many of us are able to kind of take knowledge to a level of abstraction where it's disconnected from anything real, and knowledge exists only for the sake of knowledge. But even well-known anthropologist Tim Ingold, for example, one of the leading thinkers in this space, has talked about the question of where knowledge exists. Does knowledge exist only in the brain? Does it exist in the interface or in the whole body, right? If your hands are doing something without your brain knowing about it, that is knowledge. How do your hands have knowledge? Or does knowledge only exist at the intersection of your body and your environment? So these are not trivial thoughts to kind of think that, oh, hunter-gatherers have all these vague ideas. These are very fundamental concepts that I think all of us should internalize and understand. That knowledge only exists in its context. People's knowledge of forests can only exist in that context. And if you want to save people's knowledge of forests and this huge repository of knowledge that we all know exists with indigenous people, the question is, they have to have continued access to those spaces. They have to have the rights to continue to manage those spaces in the way they have doing for centuries. It is not something that we can document in textbooks and class books and make, I mean, that's all outdated. Of course, now it's all YouTube and Instagram posts. We cannot bring all this knowledge to social media and say, chalo, we've done a great job. We've documented indigenous knowledge. Let's move on. So this is a very important point, and it is vital. I mean, the Forest Rights Act, everybody knows about it. There's been huge debates now over 10 years about whether it's good or bad, and everybody's settled on it's largely good. It has not done significant damage. It stopped some large scale things like the Niyamgiri development projects of mining and stuff like that. But what most people have overlooked is that the question of community rights, a community's rights to manage a particular forest, has largely been overlooked. There are few instances where this right has been granted, but for the majority, it's seen as settled individual rights and people's claims to land, which is fair enough. That has to be done. Even the rare case like BR Hills, where a community forest right has been granted, they have not really allowed the people to manage landscapes in the way they have been managing it for centuries. And there is a long way to go in that realm. Like, we have to understand traditional management practices and see how we can manage this, allow people to continue to manage these landscapes so that that knowledge and culture is not forgotten altogether, right? So the question is, we all know that this knowledge is very important, but is it really important for biodiversity? Or can biodiversity manage even if all this indigenous knowledge of traditionally managing culture is forgotten? Here I'll switch a long way to say Europe, or say the global north more broadly, because all of us know that here are a lot of indigenous people, great knowledge. We assume it's highly depopulated in the West, but that's not the case. So a very nice story about, say, Europe, what's happening with wolves. So wolves are coming back across Europe. Large mammals in general are coming back across the world, across Americas as well. You have mountain lions, or many animals coming back. And the question is, many of those cultures do not know what to do with it. So wolves, when they started coming back to Italy about 10 years ago, it was fascinating that in Italian, there is one word for a combination of one shepherd, one large dog, and one small dog. The three together form one word. And this combination is vital to protect yourself from wolves, for herders to protect their sheep from wolves. You need a small dog that's very alert, that will immediately see a wolf and start yapping very loudly and go call the herder, who can be around doing something else. Herder doesn't have to be vigilant 24/7 or while he's herding or she's herding her sheep. A big dog has to stand its ground and bark loudly and make a noise, and at the risk of its own self, has to keep the wolves at bay for long enough for the herder to come. And when the herder comes, the wolves invariably get scared and run away from the people. Now, though the wolves went extinct, this word did not go extinct in the Italian language. And so when wolves started coming back, the cultures were able to accept and accommodate wolves much better than, say, their northern neighbors like in Germany. Germany, I don't know if any of you are following international news, but they're having a really hard time with wolves, right? Germany has about, size-wise, they are similar. Germany is a little bigger actually, but it has only about 1,600 wolves versus 3,300 in Italy. And though wolves are now becoming a problem in Italy as well, for the last 10 years, they've been integrating slowly into Italian society without there being a huge problem around it. And then if you compare somewhere like North America, or more specifically the United States of America, that has no culture, other than the indigenous people who are for the most part wiped out, most of the kind of white settlers have no culture of living with wolves. It's a much sadder story. Overall, America has half the number of wolves compared to Europe, though they have double the number of forests, right? So this culture of how you live with animals, even wolves and large mammals, is vital across the world. And without that, biodiversity is going to suffer badly, starting from the largest of mammals. Forget about all the smaller ends of biodiversity that modern science does not yet recognize for the most part.
Thanks, Tash, for your insights. So, continuing your line of thought on the pastoralist communities and wolves, in India, an area which is combined of Germany and Italy is probably shared between people and wolves, especially the pastoralist communities. Iravati from the Coexistence Consortium has been working on wolves and their relationship with the pastoralist communities in the Deccan. And I would like to request Iravati to share some of her findings and insights on how the local communities have, how they relate to the wolves and how it's built into their folklore and culture. If you could share with us, Ira.
Yeah, thanks, Orithro. I'm just keeping my video shut because there's a lot of light. Before I talk about biocultural diversity and pastoralism, maybe it would make more sense to speak about pastoralism as a livelihood first. So extensive pastoralism relies on movement of cattle and livestock between different geographies depending on the season. So this livelihood tracks resources that are necessary for animals. And the Deccan Peninsula in India is a place with a rich culture of pastoralism. There are many pastoralist communities here, and they largely rely on open natural ecosystems, so grasslands, scrublands, and similar open ecosystems. And just like many other natural resource-based livelihoods, pastoralism has a very strong culture associated with it. So they have specific deities who were pastoralists. They have folk songs and stories associated with their animals. Because pastoralism uses these native habitats all across India, they have shared space with animals like wolves and leopards. And these animals have found their way into stories, myths, and folk songs. Sadly, at least with the communities that I have interacted with, these stories are vanishing from people's living memory. However, I'd like to mention these two interesting instances, one from Western Maharashtra and one from Northern Karnataka. So in Northern Karnataka, the Kuruba pastoralists, they rear these indigenous breeds of Kenguri sheep. And an older pastoralist once told us a story, which some of you may have heard even from Krupakar and Senani's documentary, Walking with Wolves. So the old man told us that the wolf is like a brother-in-law. He referred to him as a Sodar Mava, and a brother-in-law who comes once in a while to take its share of livestock. And he said that we don't really mind the wolf, coming and visiting us once in a while, because it's a saubhagya for us to and for a herd to be blessed by this visit. And in Western Maharashtra, interestingly, I heard a more elaborate story from an older Dhangar man. So Dhangars are the group of pastoralists who rear indigenous sheep breeds there. And there are these folk songs called Ovya or Ovi, like a singular version of it. So these used to be very popular folk songs amongst Dhangars, but sadly, hardly anyone now knows how to sing them. So these are songs which are sung together and in a rhythm while doing some activity. So an old Dhangar man told us that there is a mention of the wolf in such a song. So the story is very interesting. It goes like this, that hundreds of years ago, Dhangars had a habit of consuming the curd, the buttermilk, and the ghee made from sheep milk. And because this milk was very high in fat, they used to fall asleep while herding their sheep in the afternoon. And their deity, a pastoralist deity, he noticed that Dhangars are sleeping under the shade of the tree in the afternoon, and their livestock is going in other people's farms and causing conflicts. So God made the wolf so that the Dhangars are alert while herding. And that's one mention that he gave us. Although he himself could not sing the folk song, which basically represents what's happening to such kind of cultural forms of transmitting such information. They're not in people's living memory anymore. This is also because they've stopped interacting as much with wolves in the landscape. But for me, it was really interesting that it's really valuable to how people reason out their interactions with biodiversity through these different cultural forms. Thanks.
Thanks, Ira, for sharing this, and also drawing parallels from what Samira said. If over time these folklores and these traditional knowledge are lost, then that will also over time erode the cultural acceptance towards wildlife that we have. Hence, it's all the more important to look at conservation from a biocultural lens and not only isolate biodiversity, culture, society and nature separately, but rather look at them together. So just adding to Iravati's story on how there are cities within local communities which act as coping mechanisms to even help cope with losses such as livestock loss that we shared. I had experienced something similar during work in West Bengal as well. So my journey in research has been started from ecology and then looking at shared spaces between people and wildlife. But then I realized that my tools were not enough to understand the full story of what's actually happening to capture the full range of interactions. So then I started dabbling in the social sciences as well to look at for a deeper understanding of the relationships between processes and patterns. So then we were trying to look at the causes for people to apply or not applying for compensation due to damage caused by elephants in that landscape. And the landscape where I work is extremely fragmented. Elephants have a lot of interaction with people, especially crop losses and human life losses. So then, as we were trying to explore the efficacy of compensation as a conflict mitigation measure, we found out that a lot of people were not claiming compensation at all. So then we assumed that this could be reasons that the compensation amount is very small, people have lost faith in the system, and the transaction cost is very high. So then we try to find out why exactly are people not claiming this benefit, which is for which they're eligible. And surprisingly, most of the respondents said that they don't need any benefits or compensation from the government because they worship elephants as a god called Mahakal. So Mahakal is traditionally a form of Shiva, but in the indigenous communities, especially the Rajbangshis of northern West Bengal, they worship the elephant as Mahakal or the destroyer. And they believe, so the effigy, the image that they worship is basically the idol of Shiva or some representative of Shiva sitting on an elephant. And then they say that whenever elephants come into their crop fields and they feed on their crops, they believe they get a better harvest next year. And also if they claim compensation for something that's being offered to the gods, then the elephants will wreak havoc on them and the gods will wreak havoc on them, and then they will not have a good harvest next year. So in some sense, and this is not a one-off story, and we have done many such interviews and local discussions across the landscape, and this has been a common string across the region wherever the Rajbangshis have lived. And interestingly, even the Adivasi communities that have migrated to the landscape to work in the tea plantations have also adopted these religious beliefs. So now they have been worshipping Mahakal, even though where they're originally from, in the Chotanagpur area, there is no such practice of worshipping the Mahakal god. That's something very interesting that I found. And another thing I would like to share is that, so Avantika, who's one of our Coexistence fellows, while she was doing her fieldwork in Darjeeling and Sikkim to find out what drives the attitude of local people towards wildlife, such as large mammals or even damage-causing wildlife, she found that there was a very common poem that was taught in schools and in houses in Nepali communities in Darjeeling. And that poem said how every life is important and every bird has its value and every living form has its value, and it's not right as humans to destroy any form of life. And whenever Avantika asked people that why are people not retaliating against damages to crops or livelihood, they say that we have learned when we were young through this poem that we should not damage any other forms of life. So this kind of coping mechanisms and culture and folklore has been embedded in various communities across India and maybe even across the world, which have helped people share space with even potentially damage-causing animals. That I found was quite interesting. So Samira, would you like to share some stories from your landscape on your work and how the local knowledge has been incorporated and you're trying to conserve the traditional ecological knowledge from the landscape and how it's important for biodiversity conservation in the long run?
Right. Thanks, Orithro. That Mahakal story is really interesting. Even though I've heard it before, but I always get fascinated by it. There are a lot of stories that I can share, but I'll just perhaps share one or two, taking from Tarsh's example about honeybees or honey, which is the honey from them is regularly harvested, and Ongsi especially has written. He went very deep into the relationships of the Solega people and honey that they harvest. There's a song that they sing when they go out to harvest, and the song itself contains a lot of interesting traditional ecological knowledge about the particular lianas which are used to tie the leaves that are used to smoke the hive, and the length of the rod that is used to take it up and things like that. And that song also contains it mentions woodpeckers as calling to give warnings about danger. It also mentioned, because that's their very strong belief in Solega, everyday life, that the calls of certain woodpeckers are portents of danger. And it also talks about the bears and the tigers that come to eat at the wax, at the larvae, that that is thrown, they throw to these animals that come. So that's a great example of coexistence, and something that we found that had not been documented anywhere in the world, that tigers come to eat bee larvae, and they don't, there's no harm, there's no negative interaction. The people know the tiger comes, the tiger is waiting when the honey is being harvested. This is of course the rock bee honey. So that's one story that I wanted to share.
Wow, really fascinating, Samira. So continuing with carnivores and local beliefs, Jia has done some fascinating work on local beliefs and practices and how that enables shared spaces with carnivores, like carnivores, most tigers and leopards across Maharashtra and Himachal. So Jia, would you like to share some of your experience and key findings or some stories that you would like to share with us?
So yeah, I just wanted to, going with the theme, share a couple more stories and how it connects to coexistence and biocultural diversity. So one of the main stories that really captured my attention when I was in Himachal was that people would keep saying that whenever I asked about a leopard, they would say "billi uski," which means the cat is her aunt, his aunt. And I would keep asking about what is the significance of it? Is there a story behind it? And there was a story about how the leopard didn't know how to hunt and would go to different which is Ghoda Chacha. And he would ask him how to hunt. And Ghoda Chacha was very smart. He knew that, if he taught the leopard how to hunt, he'll come and hunt him. So what he did was said that you can attack from the back. And when the leopard tried to attack from the back, the horse just kicked him back. And he went and fell in a ditch. And after that, he went to Billi Masi and asked her how to hunt. And you know how leopards hunt by catching the jugular vein. So here it's called the kukri. So the practice of the habit of attacking at the neck is something that the cat taught the leopard. So there is multiple things interesting about it. One that it's a great example of how there is a lot of ecological knowledge that is integrated into the stories that exist within these landscapes, and we might not recognize it as ecological knowledge and coming from a specific space, but what it does is it carries on this information through the generations as well. And another thing that, another aspect of it that I found very interesting was the relational aspect of it, that often animals are referred to as relatives of various kinds and as related to each other in different ways. So in a way, many cultures across India and the world think of socio-cultural, socio-ecological systems as one and us together, and not as, necessarily separate entities that we need to understand separately. It's even ecology is understood through kinship and through care and love and all of these things. So I just wanted to use this story to illustrate that aspect of it. Yeah.
And what's really fascinating is that across landscapes, be it Himachal or even Arunachal Pradesh or Maharashtra, there are stories of shared kinship with large carnivores. And of course, these landscapes are disjunct, and it's very unlikely that these communities shared any common origin. So how do you think that these kind of beliefs have converged, if I can use the evolutionary term, to have to see that the beliefs regarding large carnivores, shared kinship, and cultural practices that enable space sharing with these carnivores have evolved across various landscapes? Would you like to throw some light, especially drawing on your work on the Waghoba from Maharashtra?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of those unanswered questions for me. So I can't really say conclusively this is where it's coming from, but I think family is a very large part of how we relate in India, like the social fabric itself has family as a very big part of it. And it's not surprising then that, when you're relating to other beings, which might not be considered as very different from the human being, in many cultures. It's not surprising that it gets extended into other animals as well, across India and probably the world, So, yeah.
Very interesting, Dee. Thanks for the insight. So, Tash, coming back to you, is there any such stories on carnivores from your landscape or even other species that you would like to share, that the beliefs that people have?
My focus has been largely on elephants for the last few years. So I haven't really opened up to carnivores, because with elephants itself, it kind of goes outwards. There are kind of numerous belief systems. There's one very interesting village called Terpakulli, for example, where the Karnataka community there, they think of elephants as other than human persons. This is very different from the mainstream Indian idea of elephants being gods, right? Because if gods continuously keep bashing you, you're not allowed to retaliate in any way. And this is also very different from the mainstream, say, Judeo-Christian worldview, where humans are on top and everybody else is below them. The elephants and people being equal, ontologically equal, so to speak, the kind of anthropological term for this, of what is something, is very important, because it allows people to think of elephants as individuals, and some elephants are good and some elephants are bad. But what they strongly believe in this village is that if they treat elephants very well, this idea of mutualism, if you treat the elephants well, the elephants will treat you well, is very strong. And they believe that every year they have a particular ritual and ceremony that they do for the elephants, and they call on the elephants, particular individuals also, and say, please don't harm us. We have children, we will live well, we will not disturb you, you don't disturb us. And elephants don't damage their village. And anecdotally, it's not them, all the neighboring people, there are other communities who live around, all believe that, elephants will never hurt Kartanaikans, including the forest department. So the forest department, when they started work, they wanted to say, oh, these people have a very good mitigation tool, but they understood it as a Hindu puja, right? If we do this puja, then nobody will have trouble with elephants. But it's not really a puja. Like understanding these people's relationships with elephants, who they call Ana Devru. Like Devru roughly means God, but it's not really that. Nilbert David has written a lot about this. It's very important. Their relationship with elephants as other than human persons is vital to allow for this thing back and forth, this interaction back and forth, where certain individual elephants can be problematic. And this is something that Nishant, a really interesting researcher who works around South Bangalore, and I think Rana, who's also here, have written about in a paper in 2012, that elephant behavior is based a lot on idiosyncratic personalities. Certain personalities behave very differently beyond the kind of Darwinian understanding of elephants are all looking for food, water, reproductive success. How they behave depends on personalities. So this mapping of indigenous knowledge and their stories and cultures into a more kind of scientific framework is really interesting in the way that is panning out. But going back, there are, I think, numerous examples of how indigenous people in their interactions, in their stories, in their language, in their songs, they prescribe various things on how you interact with nature, and conservation is not vital. It's more about how you treat nature well, right? Conservation is almost automatic offshoot of that, so long as you treat nature well. There are multiple songs, for example, the Panya love song that it goes like Chakke Thinnum Pole, Kuruvi Thinnum Pole. That's like you eat the jackfruit and you eat the seeds. Everybody loves to eat the jackfruit in the season. I'm trying to just remember the words. Mullen Parambil Avane Kandale Kanda, which is basically, even if you love the jackfruit and the seeds so much, if you see them in a very thorny place, that's not for you. Don't be greedy and don't go take it. That's for others, right? So no matter how much you want something, this idea of not over harvesting, it's framed. The metaphorical thing is again linked to lust and all of that. It's a much more complicated story when you're in love with somebody and all that. But the very practical the takeaway from that is be very careful about how you harvest things. And all kids all kind of know this song, and they're very careful about not everything from the forest is something that we should take. There's also another song about, the song itself is a recipe for what you do for a headache. It basically says that for a particular headache, you have to go down to a particular stream and you have to take a particular fish and pluck a particular set of herbs and make a rasam out of it, and you can have it. But in that song, I embedded certain management interventions to make sure that stream is healthy and those herbs continue to exist. Right. So this kind of culture, I think, is vital for biodiversity. I think most of us agree for most part that culture will suffer hugely if biodiversity is lost, right? But will biodiversity suffer hugely if culture is lost? Is a question that particularly all of us urban people who are very disconnected from nature do not encounter on a daily basis and do not think about it, right? We don't care where our food and where everything is coming from. But this is not the case for a vast number of people, not just indigenous people. I'd argue even farmers, pastoralists, as we've heard about to a large extent here, all of them depend on an everyday basis on a range of forms of nature who they interact with every day. And their understanding and knowledge of these species, this culture that they have associated with biodiversity, is vital to keep those species and spaces alive. So I hope that this whole idea of biocultural diversity can be mainstreamed and brought out more into the public sphere, which is something we, hopefully will do a lot more with the Coexistence Consortium and all the amazing Coexistence Fellows. I think many of them are here today for studying these interactions more and understanding these interactions much better across the country.
Thanks, Tash. And continuing with your observations on how we are trying to, influence and ensure biocultural conservation. So basically, taking forward the of the today's Biodiversity Day from agreement to action. The next section will focus on what we as a consortium are doing to make sure that we are able to conserve biocultural diversity while being cognizant of the indigenous knowledge systems, their cultural beliefs and practices. So the consortium was created as a network of conservation researchers and practitioners with members who have been working on the domain of biodiversity conservation, human-wildlife coexistence across various landscapes in India and abroad. So our vision is to foster coexistence between nature and society using a holistic, inclusive, and a just approach, which is based on rights, a just approach to nature conservation, and in a way that's sensitive to local rights of the indigenous communities and indigenous people wherever we work. So our governance model is also such that we are open to members from various disciplinary backgrounds. In fact, we strive to make sure the consortium has representation from various disciplines, be it ecology, anthropology, social science, and the whole suite in between. And of course, when we're talking about coexistence, we are not only posing the picture of a very harmonious approach where people are happily living with animals. We know that largely is not possible. Wherever people, and especially large-bodied wildlife that can potentially cause damage, they share space with people. But by coexistence, we imply areas where people are sharing space with the wildlife, and it's of course a dynamic process. However, wherever there are damages caused due to either wildlife or people, we endeavor to keep those within tolerable limits, and the limits are of course locally determined based on local context. So based philosophy, the consortium has been working on 3 main programs so far, and we hope to add more programs to our belt. Our flagship program being the Coexistence Fellowship Programme, which is hosting today's webinar, and the fellowship program is supported by the British Asian Trust through its Coexistence Fund. And he will talk about more next on how the philosophy of biocultural diversity, inclusivity, and rights-based approach has been incorporated into the fellowship program. We also have 2 other pathways that we are currently working on, one being communication and other being policy. The communication program is aimed at creating a narrative on shared spaces between people and wildlife as a reality rather than an exception. So we want to counter narratives of conflicts. So whenever people and large animals share space, the usual narrative of conflict, we're trying to negate that through highlighting systems where people actually share space with wildlife on a daily basis. And these negative impacts are an extreme manifestation of coexistence rather than the norm. We also have a policy program where we are trying to figure out ways to effectively manage the negative interactions between humans and elephants in existing policy laws and guidelines. And also, of course, we're trying to include local rights and biocultural diversity in whatever framework we're to propose. So now I'll request Dhi to introduce us to the fellowship program and how that sort of encapsulates the philosophies of biocultural diversity and rights-based approach. And then we will seek out some stories from our fellows on their findings from fieldwork on biocultural diversity, and some if they have to share some interesting anecdotes with us. So Dhi, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Aradhru. Yeah, so in last year, in October, we've started the fellowship for Coexistence Fellowship. And there's multiple aspects of the fellowship that overlap with the idea of biocultural diversity. So before we get into that, just to give a general idea of the structure of the fellowship. So the fellows work in pairs in different landscapes, and the idea is to support individuals who are from that landscape to work in their own landscape. And here we are giving more stress to being from the area and having knowledge about the region rather than educational qualifications and degrees. So that's something that we're doing. And we're also, what we've tried to do is pair the fellows with people from the educational background and things like that, that would support the project in terms of taking it forward and communicating to a larger audience. And there's a lot of learning that these often disparate sets of people can learn from each other. So the idea of the Coexistence Fellowship is to also create that space where they can work as equal as people with equally relevant knowledge and understanding to learn from each other and produce something and work for the landscape that they're in. So we've started this project in October, and they had about a month and a half of training that they went through, and that was also in the spirit of integrating both ecological and social science research and conservation practices. So the kind of coursework that we had was very interdisciplinary and tried to inculcate different disciplines and its understanding into this coursework, so that going forward they would have the skill sets and the technical abilities to study from a wide range of subjects and also understand how they're enmeshed with each other and affect each other as well. So not just as an ecological study that looks at that aspect of it and then a social science study that looks at another aspect, but as things that integrate into each other. Yeah, and this is the more broader ways in which we're trying to inculcate biocultural diversity into the fellowship. And we're also attempting in smaller ways to move towards being more inclusive in the fellowship. Of course, it is a journey because the resources for it is not always, readily available to make it accessible to everybody. But what we're trying to do is be more conscious about how accessible we can be as a fellowship. So, for example, in the application process, we're trying to open it up to video and audio formats of, doing the application rather than just a written application, so that people who might not be comfortable as much with writing can also apply for this fellowship. And even the coursework, we're moving towards building a repository of material that can be in multiple languages and also in simpler English that can be more accessible to a wider range of people. So in these ways, we're trying to inculcate, because we find biocultural diversity important, and we want to make this a space where we can foster more work in various landscapes across multiple cultures and multiple ecosystems. We're trying to find ways in which we can create such a space. Yeah. Yeah, sorry, there was one more point. I also wanted to add about the outputs that are produced through this fellowship. So the idea was to also break out of the, the typical peer-reviewed journal kind of outputs that come the, like the gold standard or the only way in which we can communicate information and see what are more accessible and more relevant ways of communicating what people learn with a larger audience. This, I think, the idea is to also find ways in which that makes sense to the local communities as well, in how it is communicated and what is a good form of communicating what they understand. So these are some of the ways in which we're trying to, break the norms that are there of how we do this and try to inculcate some of these ideas into the fellowship. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Dee. So just expanding on a couple of points that she mentioned. So we are trying to break the language barrier where English is the only form of knowledge exchange, means of communication, because India being such a diverse country with so many languages. So we are taking small steps. Even in the application process, we are opening up to languages that at least the consortium speaks. We are using at least 7-8 commonly spoken languages in India, and applicants can apply using video recordings or audio clips in any of these languages in text format or audio format. That's one. Also, we give a lot of stress on the consent of local communities in whichever projects are planned, so that the local voice in conservation paradigm, which is largely been ignored, is now highlighted through our fellowship program. Coming to the fellowship program, we have had some very interesting stories and documentation by our fellows, and some of which they are trying to put out in various forms, such as photo stories or videos on YouTube, or even popular articles. So continuing with my bias towards large carnivores and elephants, I would first call upon Dorjele, who's and Shirab. They're working on the pastoralist communities and their relationship with large carnivores in Ladakh landscape, but in the Ladakh region. But they were working on other ungulates and their conservation. So Dorje, आप कुछ anecdotes हमारे साथ share करना चाहेंगे क्या कि मतलब जुले कि लद्दाख में communities में क्या religious beliefs है wildlife को लेके या cultural practices क्या है, please share कीजिए.
जी, हेलो एवरीवन, जुले. तो मैं लद्दाख से, और यहाँ पे हमारे यहाँ पे ज्यादातर बुद्धिस्ट है जी. तो बुद्धिस्ट में सबसे एक बड़ा फेस्टिवल होता है जिसको लोसर माना जाता है जी. तो उस टाइम पे हमारे यहाँ पे आइबेक्स का काफी मतलब आटे को आइबेक्स जैसा बना के घर में रखा जाता है लोसर के टाइम पे जी. तो जब लोसर के फर्स्ट सेकेंड डे के बाद एक फेस्टिवल होता है फुल डे के लिए, जिसमें आइबेक्स किसी को आइबेक्स बना के पूरा गांव में राउंड करता है, टर्न बाय टर्न किसी दूसरा घर में जाके फेस्टिवल उसके ऊपर गाना, आइबेक्स के ऊपर गाना गाता है, उसके ऊपर स्टोरी सुनाता है सब लोगों को. तो जब हमारे गांव में कोई बड़ा बुजुर्ग था, तो उनसे जब मैंने उनके साथ बातचीत किया तो उन्होंने ये बोल रहा था कि आज हमारे यहाँ पे सुबह 4 बजे जूनिपर का इंसेंस लगा जाता है, जो माना जाता है कि आइबेक्स हमारे गांव में आज पधार के लिए आ रहा है. तो आइबेक्स के ऊपर डाइटिस बैठ के हमारे गांव में आज विजिट करने के लिए आ रहा है. तो उसके लिए सुबह 4 बजे इंसेंस जैसा वो जूनिपर का लगा जाता है जी हर घर में. तो उसके बाद फिर गांव में टर्न बाय टर्न किसी को आइबेक्स जैसा पूरा फुल उसका बॉडी आइबेक्स के जैसा, फिर हॉर्न, ये सब आइबेक्स की तरह बना के फिर वो बंदा आगे आगे जाके किसी दूसरे के घर में जाता है. तो उनके घर में विजिट करने के लिए डाइटिस गया है, तो उसके पीछे पूरा गांव वाले लोग आइबेक्स के पीछे जाता है जी. तो उनके घर में पूरा पार्टी चलता है, उनके घर में आइबेक्स के हॉर्न के ऊपर गाना गाता है, फिर आइबेक्स के बॉडी के ऊपर पूरा फुल वो गाना गा के एक एक करके सबके घर में ऐसे राउंड करता है जी. तो जब मैंने उनसे ये पूछा था कि तो इसको क्यों माना जाता है कि डायटिस का मतलब ऐसे बैठने वाला है, आवेग्स को क्यों माना जाता है? तो उन्होंने बोला कि जो सबसे बड़ा आवेग्स आता है, मेल आवेग्स क्लास 4-5 को, ये लोग बिल्कुल डायटिस का मूवमेंट करने के लिए यूज करता है बोल के उनको काफी प्रोटेक्शन और ये सब दिया जाता है जी। तो गऊ में जब किसी खेत में भी कोई आवेग्स आएगा तो उसमें बड़ा मेल, सबसे बड़ा मेल और ये सब होगा तो वो लोग पत्थर कभी नहीं मरता है जी। तो ये इसको हम नहीं करना, इसको बिल्कुल पत्थर नहीं मरना, ये हमारे लिए नुकसान करेगा, ये डायटिस का ये है बोल के। बाकी जो कोई छोटा आइबेक्स ऐसा होगा तो उनको थोड़ा पत्थर ऐसे ऐसे फेंक के उनको थोड़ा साइड पे भगा लेता है जी। तो इसी तरह काफी हमारे वहाँ पे भी ऑलरेडी कुछ वाइल्ड लाइफ के लिए कम्युनिटीज खुद प्रोटेक्शन करके उनको इस तौर पे मतलब मानते हैं जी। ये एक छोटा सा था। तो इसी तरह एक छोटा इसके साथ ऐड करना चाहते हैं कि एक में जब मैं वेस्टर्न लद्दाख में काफी कोई 100 लोगों के साथ इंटरव्यू करने का एक मौका मिला था। तो उस टाइम पे मैंने कोई हंटर के साथ बात किया था, तो आपने कभी आइबेक्स को हंट किया कि नहीं किया? तो उन्होंने बोल रहा था कि जब मैंने वो एक्चुअली डॉक्टर था तो वो रिटायर होने के बाद वो हंटिंग के लिए काफी बढ़ गया था। तो उन्होंने एक आइबेक्स को हंट किया था। जब उसको शूट किया था तो आइबेक्स को लगा नहीं, बट वो काफी हाइट वो बोल रहा था कि कम से कम 40-50 हाइट के पहाड़ से मैं नीचे गिर गया था। तो उसके बाद मुझे काफी मतलब उसका बॉडी और इन सब को तो कुछ चोट इतना बड़ा नहीं आया, बट उसको कुछ अंदर से बीमार हुआ था। जब उसको डायटिस और मतलब हमारे ट्रेडिशनल उसमें लामा जी या मोंग इन सब से बुला के पूजा वूजा किया तो उन्होंने बोल रहा था कि आपने किसी आइबेक्स को हंटिंग किया होगा, उसकी वजह से आपको ये बीमार आ रहा है। अगर आप हंटिंग छोड़ देगा तो आपका बीमार खत्म। तब से वो बंदे ने हंटिंग बिल्कुल ही बंद कर दिया। ऐसा भी मतलब कोई लोग है जी। थैंक यू जी।
थैंक यू दोर्जे ये स्टोरीज हमारे साथ शेयर करने के लिए। तो लद्दाख से वी गो टू वेस्ट बंगाल नाउ। आई वुड रिक्वेस्ट प्रियंका, who is another fellow doing their project on elephants and also fieldwood extraction and ecosystem restoration from North Bengal. So Priyanka, would you like to share some stories that you have come across on local beliefs on elephants from the place you work?
Yeah, hi everyone. Uh, so in North Bengal, Rajbongshis is an indigenous community. They were originally animists, but with time their religion has undergone a lot of Sanskritization. So in North Bengal, elephant is nothing like Ganesh or the Ganesh Puja that is normally associated with elephant. So Mahakal is basically an idol of elephant on top of which Shiva sits, and Mahakal literally translates into a big doom. So they say that it's they are living in the land of Mahakal. So if Mahakal visits their crop fields, then they say it's like an homage they're paying to the god for staying on his or on his land. And they say if elephants come to their field and feed on certain parts, then in the other part of the field, the agriculture expands. And also, they think that if they file compensation against this loss, then there might be a bigger doom in form of property damage or life loss. And I once, when I was doing the forest selection study, I was following their indirect signs like footsteps. And once, just for fun, I was stepping on the footsteps, and old women in that village called out and they told me that you should not step on Mahakal Baba's footsteps, then some big curse will come upon you, because Baba had come last night and he blessed our village. So these are things that are very deeply ingrained in the Rajvamshi community, which I don't think any model can foster. Yeah.
Thanks, Priyanka, for sharing this interesting story with us. So we are almost at the end of our time, but I've been seeing some fascinating inputs and discussions in the chat box. So if some of you would like to share some stories from your landscape where you have worked in, or something that you've heard on local folklore, biocultural diversity, or your thoughts, it'd be great to hear from your stories as well.
Manage this, but anyone wants to raise your hand, I think maybe if there's anything you want to share, particularly any of the other fellows.
Yeah. So Asta, you were sharing some stories in the chat box. Would you like to share with us here? And of course, the other stories that you have seen in the chat box, we'll try to compile all of them, and Nicole from our team will reach out to you directly, perhaps to gather more information on the stories that you shared.
हाय अरित्र।
हाय आस्था।
हाँ हाय। हाँ मतलब आप लोगों ने बहुत सारी स्टोरी बताई, हर लैंडस्केप की अपनी स्टोरी होती है। सो आई फील कि जब हम स्टोरी कलेक्ट करने के बारे में बात करते हैं, और मैं चैट बॉक्स में भी काफी देर से पढ़ रही थी, लोग ज्यादा फोकस इंडिजिनस पीपल के ऊपर करते हैं, जो मुझे आई फील इट इज ऑल्सो वेरी कॉलोनियल आइडिया। जब हम ऐसे सोचते हैं कि सिर्फ इंडिजिनस पीपल जो हैं उनके पास बहुत नॉलेज है, तो ये वैसा ही आइडिया है जैसे हम जो एंथ्रोपोलॉजी पढ़ते थे ना बहुत साल पहले लोग, तो उसमें क्या होता था कि भूखे नंगे लोगों को देखा नहीं कि उन पे रिसर्च करना शुरू कर दिया। ये मुझे वैसा ही आइडिया लगता है बहुत हद तक। तो मुझे ये लगता है कि हमें कभी भी जब भी हम फील्ड में जाते हैं, तो वो कौन सी कम्युनिटी है ये देख के कभी भी बायसनेस नहीं आनी चाहिए। तो मेरा जो एक्सपीरियंस है, मैं एग्रीकल्चर फैमिली से बिलोंग करती हूँ, और मैं बिल्कुल इंडिजिनस नहीं हूँ। मैं बैकवर्ड कम्युनिटी से जरूर आती हूँ, लेकिन मैं इंडिजिनस लोगों में से नहीं हूँ। लेकिन स्टिल मेरे घर में बहुत सारी चीजें ऐसी हैं जो फॉलो की जाती हैं। उसमें से मैंने जैसे बोला कि जयकाल का मैंने एक स्टोरी बताई कि उसके बारे में है कि राम, जो लॉर्ड राम थे, उन्होंने उसको श्राप दिया था, एंड देन उन्होंने इसको ये श्राप दिया था क्योंकि वो सीता की खोज में निकल रहे थे, एंड उन्होंने बोला कि तुम बताओ मुझे कि सीता कहाँ है। तो उस टाइम पे जयकॉल क्या कर रहा था, वो अपने लिए एक डेन बना रहा था, और उन्होंने अवधि में उससे पूछा कि सीता को देखा है क्या। तो उसने बोला, का जानी सीता का जानी मीता, अब तक खोदे हुए अढ़ाई बीता। तो उसने उसको ये जवाब दिया गुस्से में कि मेरे को मेरा काम करने दो और तुम भाड़ में जाओ। तो राम को बहुत गुस्सा आ गया, और उन्होंने जयकॉल को श्राप दिया कि तुम जो है वो जिंदगी भर डेन बनाती रहोगी और भूलती रहोगी। तो ये एक फोकलोर है, हमारे यहाँ पे भी प्लेन्स में इस तरह का बोला जाता है। देन जैसे मैं सारस पे काम कर रही हूँ, सारस पे भी बहुत ज्यादा फोकलोर्स हैं, और हम लोग करेंटली इसी के ऊपर काम कर रहे हैं। और वो सब के अपने अपनी, इवन हर डिस्ट्रिक्ट का फोकलोर बहुत अलग है, हर कास्ट का फोकलोर बहुत अलग है। तो मैं इसमें बहुत बिलीव करती हूँ। जैसे कि एक स्टोरी है कि हमारे यहाँ एक अवध रीजन में एक गांव है, वहां पे लोग फोकलोर जो है, जैसे गीतों के बारे में बात हो रही थी, सॉन्ग के बारे में बात हो रही थी, वहां पर भी लोग शादियों में बिकॉज दे बिलीव कि सारस जो है वो एक पेयर है, एंड दे आर लाइक दे नोन फॉर लाइक लव बर्ड्स ना, तो उनके लिए कि वो गाना गाने से अच्छा रहेगा, तो वो लोग गाँव में एक गीत गाते हैं जिसमें कि सारस को हंस और हंसा के नाम से डाल के वो शादियों में वो गीत गाते हैं, बिकॉज दे बिलीव कि ये जोड़ा इसी तरीके से बना रहे। तो इस तरह की बहुत सारे फोकलोर्स हैं जो मतलब सारस से भी रिलेटेड है। और जैसे मैं अभी बता रही थी कि जो मड वास्प होता है, उसके बारे में एक फोकलोर है कि उसको घर में अगर वो लगा रहा है तो उससे हमें फोड़ना नहीं है, क्योंकि अगर हम जितनी बार फोड़ेंगे उतनी बार हमें उसका श्राप मिलेगा, और हम उतने ज्यादा ब्लाइंड होते जाएंगे अपनी लाइफ में। और वो ब्लाइंडनेस का तरीका होता है कि हमारे आंख के ऊपर एक छोटा सा पिंपल जैसा निकल आएगा और वो जितनी बार किया होगा उतनी ज्यादा तुम्हारे ऊपर। तो इस तरह के बहुत सारे स्टोरीज हैं जो आई फील कि वो सब शेयर होनी चाहिए और सब लोगों को उस पर मतलब बात करनी चाहिए। और जैसे मुझे बहुत अच्छा लगा ये आइडिया कि हाँ इन सबका एक कलेक्टिव एक बुक बननी चाहिए, वो कहीं से भी हो, मतलब अभी हम रीजन या इंडिया अभी के लिए ले सकते हैं, लेकिन उसके अलावा भी उसे हमें थोड़ा करना चाहिए, क्योंकि सिर्फ हम इंडिया जब बोलते हैं तो हम बॉर्डर्स में उसको एक ये दे रहे हैं, जबकि स्टोरीज बॉर्डर नहीं होती हैं, स्टोरीज तो ट्रैवल करती है ना अक्रॉस द वर्ल्ड। तो हमें उसको खोजना चाहिए और आई थिंक उस पर वर्क करना चाहिए। थैंक यू।
Thank you, Asta. Very interesting points. So we have towards the end of our panel discussion today, and we would love to hear more from all the participants, but we are slightly limited for time. So Tash, can I request you to conclude and summarize for us, and maybe have some concluding remarks? Thanks.
Thanks, Arithro. I think it's been a very vibrant discussion with lots of people contributing lots of really interesting stories. I don't know if I can do justice in trying to conclude or summarize any of that in any meaningful way. But I think the key is to keep this dialogue going. I think lots of people have mentioned this in the chat box. If you can all write to us and we stay connected in some form and put all of these stories together in various ways, I think that would be really great. It's really exciting to see so much interest from so many people in exactly this topic. It's very heartening to know that everybody is so excited and enthused about it. The chat box is very busy there. So yeah, hopefully we can keep this going. I don't think I want to summarize in any way, but join the mailing list and things like that. And hopefully we will be able to stay in touch and have more of these stories and allow for even smaller group discussions more than these webinar/seminar type of things where a few of us speak and others interject in the chat box and with small anecdotes. Have smaller, more detailed discussion would be great. So yeah, I look forward to being in touch with everybody and to keep chatting about all of these really interesting stories around how culture and biodiversity are intrinsically linked to each other. Thank you, everyone.
Everyone for your participation and your time, and thanks to especially Oro from British Asian Trust for pushing us to hold this session today, and your inputs have been most useful in structuring today's panel discussion. Thanks everyone.